Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday, everybody. I hope you're having a restful weekend. Let's begin today's episode with the economy, and we look at two developments related to corruption and misdeeds in China's financial system. Chinese financial media outlet, the Economic Observer, has published a report this week about a, quote, anti-corruption storm blowing through the securities industry, end quote. The report says that since 2023, quote, more than 100 cadres in the financial system have been subject to disciplinary review, involving banks, insurance, securities, and other fields. In July 2024, the anti-corruption campaign in the securities industry intensified, with major issues focusing on financial irregularities in IPO business and other areas, end quote. On the 14th of August, a person from a South China securities firm told the Economic Observer Network that the recent frequent investigations of senior executives in investment banking and securities firms indicate that due to the significant economic interests involved in IPO issuance, regulatory authorities are focusing on issues related to investment banking, including IPOs. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai similarly reports that this week Chinese authorities have doled out 75 fines so far this year to listed companies, intermediate agencies and individuals for failing to properly observe rules and regulations, more than double the 36 fines that were issued over the same period last year, as regulators crack down on shortfalls in transparency and accountability. 30 disciplinary sanctions and 45 enforcements of regulatory measures were handed out to 117 individuals, including lawyers, certified accountants, sponsor representatives, executives of security firms, and financial advisors. Meanwhile, in a shocking but frankly not surprising report, also published this week, called China's Imaginary Trade Data, Brad Setzer, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations with expertise in global trade and capital flows, looked at China's, quote, new way of calculating its goods surplus in its formal balance of payments data, end quote, and concludes that it is, quote, deeply misleading. It also explains the apparent fall in the current account surplus, end quote. Setzer argues that, quote, the most important part of the IMF's latest assessment of China is, alas, the appendix on China's new methodology for calculating China's trade balance, end quote. It at least explains why China's balance of payments trade surplus diverges from China's customs trade surplus and why the gap started to explode around 2022. Quote, as I have noted in the past, China's data doesn't agree with itself. One measure of the goods deficit is a lot bigger than another measure of the goods surplus, end quote. Bottom line, he argues, there is no good reason to think that this adjustment captures anything important about how China's economy interacts with the global economy. Quote, all this fake trade deficit does is reduce China's reported current account surplus, as the goods surplus in the balance of payments is now about $300 billion, over 1.5 percentage points of China's GDP, smaller than what it should be in the balance of payments data. I personally now estimate the current account surplus to be close to $700 billion, even after the drop tied to the resumption of tourism in 2023. End quote. Next up, we move to the South China Sea, where wider geopolitical tensions continue on a slow boil. While it looks like the situation around the Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal may have stabilized for the time being, there may be a new potential flashpoint between Beijing and US ally Manila. This is the Sabina Shoal, which is well inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but is claimed by China. State-run The Global Times writes this week that the, quote, Philippines is planning to send a second Coast Guard vessel to anchor in the lagoon in China's Xianbin Shoal in an attempt to construct a forward deployment base in the form of a semi-permanent floating platform, end quote. Yang Xiao, deputy director of the Institute of Maritime Strategic Studies under the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, part of the Ministry of State Security, told the Global Times, quote, China will not allow the Philippines to deploy another large Coast Guard ship to anchor at the shoal and increase the scale of the floating platform, end quote. At the same time, the Philippines Department of National Defense Secretary warned this week that the Philippines, quote, must brace for China's increasingly aggressive actions as it asserts its presence in the West Philippine Sea,
It will be a continuous struggle for presence and for assertion of sovereign rights in the area, so you will have to expect these things to happen. They will stick to their narrative, which we know there is no support for whatsoever. All they have on their side is brute force and might, and that's what they're going to do. Hopefully they will listen to reason and heed the appeals of not only the Philippines, but other countries to temper their moves and act in accordance with international law." End quote. Meanwhile, yesterday, Friday, Philippine Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo told reporters that his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, had expressed to him his, quote, "very dramatic alarm," end quote, over a mid-range missile system that the United States military recently deployed to the Philippines. The comments were reportedly made during their talks last month in Laos on the sidelines of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations meeting with Asian and Western countries. Manalo expressed, quote, "We discussed it, and, well, they made it very dramatic. I said you shouldn't be worried," end quote. Manalo said Wang warned the presence of the US missile system could be, quote, "destabilizing," end quote, but he said he disagreed, telling Wang, quote, "They're not destabilizing, and the missile system was only in the Philippines temporarily," end quote. Regular viewers will remember back in April, the US Pentagon said it transported the mid-range missile system, a land-based weapon that can fire the Standard Missile-6 and the Tomahawk land attack missile, from the US to the northern Philippines as part of combat exercises with Philippine troops, though these were not used in those exercises. China has strongly opposed increased US military deployments to the region. Now, on this theme, the US moving military hardware to allies in the region to counteract China, we have one last development under the story to cover. This week, UK-based The Financial Times reports that the US is easing its restrictions on sharing sensitive technology with the UK and Australia, removing barriers to trilateral defence cooperation as the allies try to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. The outlet explains that the US Department of State is amending its international traffic and arms regulation rules to facilitate military-related technology sharing with the allies, raising some hurdles for AUKUS, the Submarine and Advanced Technology Development Accord the allies agreed to back in 2021. The State Department said the reform would mean the UK and Australia did not need to apply for licenses to obtain American technology for roughly 80% of their defence-related trade with the United States. One UK official described the reforms as a, quote, "big deal," end quote, because it was, quote, "about the UK, Australia and US being as competitive as they can with China," end quote, adding that the move would ease roadblocks to cooperation on Pillar 1 of AUKUS, which involves the US sharing nuclear propulsion technology to enable Australia, in conjunction with the UK, to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. Australia's Defence Minister expressed on the news, quote, "These critical reforms will revolutionise defence trade, innovation and cooperation, enabling collaboration at the speed and scale required to meet our challenging strategic circumstances," end quote. Now, moving from a cold theatre in this new Cold War to a hot one, next up we discuss China and the Ukraine war. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing and subscribing are the only ways in which this channel can grow and be shown to new people. So this is a tremendous help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Jude Blanchett is Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is a well-respected voice on Chinese elite politics, ideology, and national policy trends. This week he published a piece in US-based Financial Affairs called "China is in Denial About the War in Ukraine: Why Chinese Thinkers Underestimate the Costs of Complicity in Russia's Aggression." He's an influential commentator in the US, and to end today's video we are going to examine his salient points from the piece. We have followed China's ongoing response to the Ukraine war and its tightening relations with Putin's Russia into a new pole or bloc in an emerging new Cold War in a fragmenting global order for some time now. We have made sure to follow closely top Chinese commentators during this time to have a sound grounding in Beijing's elite opinion on all of this. It's just as useful to be grounded in how Washington's foreign policy elite are discussing all of this as well. This is a long piece from Blanchett, but it is worth giving him the space to unpack his ideas. I always put these long quotes last in videos so that viewers who are not interested in these deeper dives into commentaries can leave the video knowing they haven't missed important updates from the first part of the video. It's also the weekend, and I feel that the core China Update audience is more interested in these deeper explorations. Now, with all that said, we are now quoting selected excerpts from the Blanchett piece directly. In the weeks following Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese government struck a tone of cautious support for Moscow. Spokespeople for the Chinese government repeatedly stressed that Russia had the right to conduct its affairs as it saw fit, alleged that the word invasion was a Western interpretation of events, and suggested that the United States had provoked Russian President Vladimir Putin by backing a NATO expansion. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi expressed sympathy for Russia's, quote, legitimate concerns, end quote. Yet outside of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, the reaction was more concerned. Although the vast majority of universities and think tanks in China are state-funded, the analysts and academics who work there still retain a degree of independence, and their views exert a measure of influence on the government. After the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, those analysts openly fretted about how the conflict could damage China's relationship with Europe and the United States, further fracture the global economy, and diminish the wealth and power of Russia, China's most important partner. Quote, the negative impact of the war on China will be huge, end quote, Yan Xuetong, one of China's foremost international relations scholars, argued in May 2022. Warning that a protracted conflict would wreak havoc on the global economy and trigger, quote, heightened tensions, end quote, between China and its neighbors, such as Japan. The West's, quote, unprecedentedly united, end quote, effort to sanction the Russian economy, as the international relations scholar Li Wei put it, surprised Chinese experts. Some, such as Wang Yongli, a former Bank of China vice president, worried that sanctions would threaten the globalization on which the Chinese economy depends. More than 2 years into the war, however, such stark public pessimism has dissipated, replaced by cautious optimism. The Russian and Chinese economies, these experts now reckon, have largely avoided crippling harm from Western sanctions. Russia is reconstituting its defense industrial base and has avoided the extreme diplomatic isolation that once seemed a plausible outcome of Putin's gambit. Some of these analysts' conclusions about the war in Ukraine, for instance, that the United States' domestic consensus in favor of arming Kiev would falter, have been borne out. But other realities are conspicuously absent from the Chinese public discourse. China has, in fact, incurred costs as a result of Putin's war and Beijing's economic and diplomatic support for it. Europe has not completely turned its back on China, but the country's deepening relationship with Russia has caused a significant deterioration in its relations with many European countries that cannot easily be reversed. And the symmetry between Putin's lust to seize Ukrainian territory and Beijing's long-standing appetite to absorb Taiwan has provoked the United States and its allies in the Indo-Pacific to harden their defenses. These blind spots matter because in China, the war in Ukraine is serving as both an observatory and a laboratory as the country prepares for heightened geopolitical conflict with the United States. As they analyze events in Ukraine, Chinese scholars seek to assess the United States' and Europe's resolve and understand what risks China might be forced to bear in a geopolitical or military crisis. Some experts, such as the leading military strategist Zhou Bo, have concluded that NATO's hesitancy to make certain major interventions on Ukraine's behalf proves that, aside from the United States, Taiwan would lack defenders in a future conflict with China. Although these scholars tend to be careful not to discuss the contours of a protracted war in the Taiwan Strait too explicitly, many seem to be drawing a straight line from the cracks in the United States' determination to support Ukraine and its likely will to stomach a possible protracted conflict with Beijing. Chinese experts, particularly those based at elite academic institutions or at think tanks affiliated with the government or military, serve as both interpreters and influencers of official policy. They publish in government-sanctioned journals and media outlets, and although their opinions frequently align with government orthodoxy, many of them also test policy ideas not yet publicly voiced by officials, or float new political propositions as trial balloons to gauge official reaction. Even under the regime of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, where public discourse is tightly controlled, some of these experts can still cautiously explore sensitive topics. walking a fine line between intellectual independence and political loyalty. Chinese experts have not been monolithic on Putin's war. From the moment Russian troops crossed into Ukraine in 2022, Chinese analysts have offered differing perspectives on the impact the conflict would have on Chinese interests and the proper interpretation of Western efforts to counter the Russian offensive. On the whole, however, their early reactions were shaped by concern that the war would mark a historical post-Cold War turning point. Chinese scholars consistently concluded that Russia's invasion would drive a major realignment of the international order. This view was trenchantly expressed by a group of scholars at the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, a think tank known for its high-quality analysis, despite its direct affiliation with China's Ministry of State Security. In February 2023, these scholars argued that the invasion was a, quote, watershed in history, end quote, that revealed the existence of a, quote, latent new order, end quote, different from the security architecture that dominated for 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. Xi Jinping has, of course, spoken of the dawn of a, quote, new era, end quote, for the global order. He has repeatedly touted the idea that the world is undergoing, quote, profound changes unseen in a century, end quote, that will be marked by growing risks but also potential benefits to China by overturning the United States' dominance in geopolitics, technology, and the global economy. Chinese scholars initially concluded that Russia's invasion would upend the international order. As the Western sanctions began to take hold and the Russian military stumbled, Chinese scholars also worried that Russia's standing as a valuable strategic partner might be in peril. One of China's most prominent experts on Russia, Feng Yujin, predicted that, quote, Russia's influence in the world economy and international political system, end quote, would, quote, decline significantly, end quote. Today, however, a substantially more sanguine outlook dominates the discourse of China's experts. They have noted the Western response to the war has not produced the most catastrophic outcomes that many had predicted. The, quote, most intense wave of sanctions in history, end quote, scholars at Renmin University's Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies concluded in a February 2024 report, quote, did not achieve the expected results, but instead brought a backlash and counter-sanctions, end quote, as Russia found lifelines for its currency and trade with China and other countries. Many Chinese analysts also contended that Putin had evaded truly damaging diplomatic isolation, citing his recent state visits to North Korea and Vietnam, and that in July he hosted Indian Prime Minister Modi in Moscow. As a hardline from the Chinese edition of the Global Times trumpeted after Putin's trip to Hanoi, quote, the West's isolation of Russia has been broken, end quote. In this view, China has avoided paying any significant economic or diplomatic price for propping up Putin's war efforts. Indeed, the war has created trends that may redound to China's benefit. The Russian economy's ability to weather Western sanctions has impressed many Chinese scholars. As the war drags on, Chinese analysts also believe that the West's unity is fracturing, as Democrats and Republicans fight, quote, fiercely against each other, and as the US presidential election approaches, the situation is getting more and more unfavorable for Ukraine, end quote. The prominent Eurasian studies expert Ding Xiaoxing wrote in February. Jin Congrong, a hawkish international relations scholar, predicted that a public backlash against support for Ukraine in European countries and the United States would eventually doom Kiev's ability to defend itself. Many of these Chinese experts' analyses are fair, even astute, but missing from the public-facing discussion in China is a true recognition of the costs Beijing has assumed as a result of its support for Putin's war. Experts' early assessments lingered on dramatic potential damage to China. Now they tend to ignore or underappreciate the serious costs Beijing has incurred. China's relations with most European countries have degenerated, probably irrevocably. In the declaration following its July summit, NATO included an unprecedentedly sharp denunciation of Beijing's behavior, calling China a, quote, decisive enabler, end quote, of Russia's war effort, language that would have been unimaginable before February 2022. Frustration with China is not limited to European policymakers. Europeans who were recently very bullish on Chinese-European relations, especially those with business interests in China, now hold a much dimmer view. A May survey of European CEOs by the European Roundtable for Industry found that only 7% believe that Europe's relations with China would improve in the next 3 years. more than 50% saw future deterioration. In a July survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations that polled nearly 20,000 people, 65% of respondents in 15 European countries agreed that China has played a rather negative or very negative role in the ongoing war in Ukraine. Although Western sanctions have not broken the Russian economy, the war in Ukraine has spurred further global economic fragmentation. For decades, Beijing has worked to build economic self-sufficiency. Chinese government planners stepped up these efforts around 2018 as they sought to prepare China for the splintering of globalization and the fracturing of supply chains. But China was not ready for the degree to which the war in Ukraine, coupled with growing national security concerns in many countries about technological dependence on China, hastened this fragmentation, prompting US and European governments, companies and investors to reallocate capital away from China and other geopolitically exposed markets. The war in Ukraine, and particularly Beijing's decision to strengthen its strategic partnership with Russia, is also exacerbating the rifts in an already fractious US-Chinese relationship. In February, a group of experts at Renmin University took stock of the global situation and concluded that, quote, the external environment is no longer continuously progressing and improving, end quote. Instead, they went on, quote, we have a situation of great changes and great struggles that are confrontational, protracted, and cruel, end quote. Although Putin remains firmly in power in Moscow, and the effort to annex Ukrainian territory has not yet yielded the outright strategic trajectory many Chinese analysts initially predicted, Beijing's external environment is far from benign. Relations with the United States remain fractious. In China's immediate neighborhood, American allies such as Australia, Japan, and the Philippines are strengthening their defensive capabilities. Conflict is destabilizing the Middle East. China's position in the international order remains strong, but is increasingly unsettled. All of this has extraordinary salience for China's own designs on Taiwan. Russia's war on Ukraine offers general lessons about the complexities of modern warfare, and possibilities for an international response to a purportedly regional dispute, and the costs of a protracted military conflict. What Xi is learning from this crisis remains inscrutable, but Chinese analysts' view offer a window into the possible lessons the Chinese government is drawing from Putin's war. Their interpretations are varied and individual. After watching 2 years of war in Ukraine, however, many have concluded that the West has no stomach for conflict and will grow tired of supporting democracies facing an invading force if the economic costs are high. This conclusion is often overstated and probably underestimates American resolve. But the very fact that they have drawn it suggests that the Taiwan Strait and the world at large may be heading in a still more dangerous direction. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Let me know what you think about today's developments, including these views from Blanchette, in the last part of today's video. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Saturday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.